So, thanks for coming everyone, and you're very welcome. My name is Simon, I'm the chair of Effective Altruism Birmingham. I'm not going to talk about what Effective Altruism is, I'll let Professor Singer do that, and we've got the very capable rest of the committee, Bryn and Ben here, are going to do a 10-minute talk a bit later on to tell you what Effective Altruism is. So I chair the Birmingham group. There are groups all over the world that are interested in effective altruism, which is doing good in the best way possible. So more on that later. So just to tell you a little bit about what's going to happen, your Master of Ceremonies for the evening is going to be Emma, who's the president of the Philosophy Society. And the only thing left for me to say is please hang around for the whole of the evening. So we've got about an hour of stuff and then a break, and then we're going to have the live pizza. And after that, there's going to be a kind of social downstairs. There's going to be free pizza, and the pizza is all going to be all the food and wine that we're going to serve will be suitable for vegans. It's all plant-based. Okay, cool. So yes, without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Emma.
Thank you, Simon, and welcome to the event. My name is Emma, and I'm the president of the Philosophy Society. I would just like to say a small disclaimer that this event is being filmed, so if anyone has any objections to being on camera, please speak to Andre, who is just over there. And he will make sure that he avoids filming you. Also, in the case of a fire, the exit is situated on the side there, so that's not a door for you to normally use, but yeah, it is a fire. So there will be a 10 to 15 minute break before we speak to Singer, so if you need to go to the loo for some air, there will be an opportunity to do so later. But if you go outside, the door locks behind you, so there will be somebody from 7:45 to 8, so just before Singer starts to speak. But if you go outside and it's after 8, then you can't get back in, so just to let you know. So the structure of the evening follows that Iain Law, who is a senior lecturer in the philosophy department, will be providing a 10-minute look into who Singer is and his works outside of effective altruism. Then there will be a screening of the TED Talk which Singer conducted in 2013, and afterwards the Effective Altruism Society will speak about the work that they conduct and what effective altruism is. We will have a break before the conference call with Singer, and afterwards we will have drinks and pizza for a small social on the ground floor afterwards. Now I shall hand over to Iain Law, who is going to provide an introduction on Singer and his work.
So this is Singer's Practical Ethics, and this is my copy, which I have had for 30 years. It's one of the first books I bought when I was a philosophy undergraduate, and it's been with me ever since. And it's an excellent distillation of the early part of Singer's career, the things that made him famous, the contributions to animal ethics, and to the kind of stuff that the effective altruism movement has grown out of, his argument that we have duties to help people in extreme poverty in distant parts of the world. So what I'm going to try and do is explain something about the philosophical underpinnings of those kinds of views for which Singer has become famous. So Singer starts his moral philosophy from a question which is very, very basic, and that is, who matters morally? And what is it about them that makes them matter morally? And Singer's answer is similar to one offered by the classical utilitarians such as Jeremy Bentham. Singer thinks that you matter morally if you are sentient. So if you are capable of experiencing pain, suffering, pleasure, then you are someone who matters morally. And he calls this kind of mattering having interests. So he thinks that all sentient beings have an interest in not suffering. And all sentient beings have that interest more or less equally. It can get a little more complicated, but basically, if you are capable of experiencing pain, then you have an interest in not doing that. And any other creature that has the capability to experience pain also has an equal interest in not doing that. Human beings might have some interests which non-human animals don't. So it's possible to argue that we have an interest in continued existence, which is partly based on our capacity to project ourselves into the future, to think about our future life. And you might imagine that some non-human animals don't have that capacity. So they can feel pain, but they don't have an imagination, they can't project themselves into the future. So you could argue that a human being has more interests than some non-human animals, but other things being equal, if the interests are the same, Singer makes a further claim, and this is his second big idea beyond sentience, is what makes you matter morally. The second big claim is not original to him. He traces it back at least as far as Kant. In fact, he says that the famous golden rule is an instance of this, and the injunction to love your neighbour as yourself is an instance of this. He says, from the moral point of view, we have to be impartial. So suppose the fact that something would hurt me provides me with a reason not to want to do that thing. Well, the fact that it would hurt me is no more morally salient than the fact that it would hurt somebody else. From a moral point of view, my interest in not suffering is just as important, but no more important, than anyone else's interest in not suffering. So if you've got the group of creatures who matter morally, and what really matters is their interests, what Singer arrives at is a principle he calls the principle of equal consideration of interests. So take those things that have interests. If we're to be thinking morally about those interests, we have to impartially consider all of those interests equally. And you could argue that all of his most famous contributions to ethics follow from this. All of the things that made him famous follow from this. So one of his most famous arguments is an argument that giving money, giving a proportion, perhaps a sizable proportion of your income to people in great need is not charity. To call it charity implies that it's okay not to do it. It's creditable to do it, but you don't have to do it. Singer argues in a famous paper, Famine, Affluence and Morality, that it is a duty to do it. And his argument is very simple. It goes like this. Suppose you were walking past a shallow pond, and in that shallow pond there was a drowning toddler. So the pond is shallow, it's only going to cover your shoes, but for the toddler it's going to be fatal unless you wade in and lift the toddler out. And Singer says, okay, you're going to ruin a pair of shoes. So you could see this as paying the cost of a new pair of shoes in order to save that life. But, Singer argues, we think it's a duty to go and save that toddler's life. We don't think that it's a kind of moral extra credit exercise. It's just demanded of us by morality that we save the child's life. Do we agree with this? It's your duty to save the child's life? So Singer extrapolates from this a kind of generalizable principle about that. If it's a duty to save a life at a cost to you equivalent to a new pair of shoes, well, it's your duty to save that life regardless of where it is. Because distance is not a morally salient feature. If we're thinking about what matters morally, if we're thinking about weighing interests, well, the fact that some people's interests are people who are very distant from us makes no difference. You could be, he argues, at least people who have incomes could be, devoting more of that income to famine relief efforts and things that will save people's lives. And this is what the Effective Altruism campaign is founded upon. So one thing that Singer's doing here is he's taking a very common thought about morality, which is that you mustn't base your moral decisions on morally unimportant factors. And he's saying that goes way, way further than you think. So distance from people who need help is not a morally important factor. Equally, he thinks, membership of species is not a morally important factor. So suppose I'm a human being and I have various interests. But suppose I become severely impaired so that my interests are reduced to a single interest, avoiding suffering. At that point, Singer thinks, I am morally on a par with a non-human animal that also has only that interest. Just because I'm a human being, it doesn't mean that my non-suffering is more of a moral demand on other people than that non-human animal's non-suffering. And it would be perfectly morally justified to say, if you had two such animals and one of me, and there was some calamity about to befall all three of us and you couldn't save us all, if you can save the two animals, well, it's the right thing to do. Equal consideration of interests requires us to think, if I can protect the interests of these two animals at the cost of sacrificing Iain's interest, that's the thing I should do, rather than protect Iain's interest at the cost of sacrificing these two animals. Singer says, if we don't think that, we're guilty of a sin in our ethical thinking, which is equivalent to racism. So racism is clearly morally inexcusable. Race is not a morally salient factor. The fact that somebody's a member of this or that race doesn't mean that their interests count for more or less. Equally, Singer says, species doesn't matter. If you've got a non-human animal that has a great many capabilities and therefore a great many interests, they matter more morally than a severely cognitively impaired human being. This is a view which has made Singer the controversial figure which he is. So, to his credit, he's always kind of trying to follow the logic of his argument to where it goes. And it means that he denies things like any principle involving the sanctity of human life. He thinks that sometimes the right thing to do could be to kill the human being. And sometimes he does that from a position of thinking it's in the interests of the human being to be killed, so he advocates for euthanasia in certain cases. But in other cases, and these are the ones that are really controversial, he will say, well, it's possible that the interests of one person in not allowing, let's say, an infant to live, that infant's interest in continued existence. So in some very carefully constructed examples, it's possible, according to Singer, that his view could justify infanticide. And this has obviously made his view controversial. Okay, that's the basics of Peter Singer's moral philosophy. I will hand over to the next person. I've forgotten who that is.
Cool. Right, so hello everyone. My name's Bryn. I'm a master's student here. I study computer science, but it's a conversion master's because I studied philosophy as my undergrad, and that was where I first heard about effective altruism and what it's all about.
Yeah, and I'm Ben. I'm a final year ancient history and archaeology student, and I was introduced to effective altruism when I was doing my A-levels. There was like a small society that was set up at my college, and I've just been involved ever since. Okay, so we're just going to like talk a little bit more about kind of what effective altruism kind of looks like in practice, and also kind of how the movement has changed a bit in the 6 or so years since Professor Singer gave his TED talk. Because while like the fundamentals are the same, we've like changed a little bit in terms of how we actually do things. So just kind of retread some of the like basic ground. Like effective altruism, as you've already heard, is essentially a philosophy and social movement dedicated to using reason and evidence to trying to find the most effective ways of benefiting others. Now, there are kind of 4 main means through which we can do this. The first one is charity, which we've already heard quite a lot about. The argument with charity is simply that, well, there are, as Singer said, like there are many causes that are really, really good to give to, but so long as we only have limited resources and we can't help everybody, we should focus on the ones that do the most good possible. Careers, we heard a bit about that, and it's an increasing focus within the movement. We're going to be talking a bit more about what an effective career looks like later on. Lifestyles, so making lifestyle changes that have a positive impact. One obvious example of this is that many people in effective altruism are vegetarians or vegans. It's just kind of an obvious example. And finally, advocacy or activism. So just trying to encourage other people to do the same thing. It's fairly straightforward. Now, to this end, there are 3 main criteria that effective altruists typically employ to try to determine which are the best causes to work on. The first one is importance, which, as you might be able to guess, basically just refers to like how important is this, like what's the scale of the problem, like how much should we care to begin with. Then there's tractability, which is how much can we actually do about the problem. So for example, you might have a problem that's like really big, but it's also not clear what you can actually do about it. And if the problem's big enough, it may still be worth it may still be worth trying, but it's something to consider. And finally, neglectedness. This kind of feeds into tractability. It's something it's another thing to think about. Like the more people who are already working on a particular problem, the less of an impact you'll probably be able to have on it. It's basically the law of diminishing returns. So like the more resources that are being put into a particular problem, the more people working on it, the less additional help is needed. Now to this end, effective altruists have kind of converged on three main cause areas, which are basically like categories of causes that kind of go together. And these are global health and poverty, helping non-human animals, and the long-term future. Singer mentioned each of these. We're going to talk a bit more about them in turn, but first, Bryn just wants to talk a bit about how the movement has changed in the last 6 or so years.
Yeah, so because the talk that you just saw was 6 years ago, there's been quite a lot of change and kind of growth and evolution since Singer gave the talk. So one of the changes that has taken place over these years is that there is now less emphasis on earning to give. Earning to give is the philosophy of deliberately taking a high-paying career and then donating as much of that as you can to effective charities. Now there's less emphasis on this now. They still think that some people should be doing this, but a lot of organisations already have enough money, right? They're already got enough funding that they can reasonably work with. And so instead of looking for more money, what they really want is sort of talented and committed people. There's also more focus now on career paths, which we're going to talk a bit more about later on, how to have an effective career, and instead of this kind of just earning to give kind of option. There's also more emphasis on advocacy, so this can involve working for an organisation that tries to kind of grow the movement, but also working or volunteering for a local group, such as EA Birmingham or EA London, or one associated with a particular university, and so on. And there's also more focus on trying to affect policy, because you might think charity's great, but it doesn't necessarily hit the root of the problem. The problem may be in your eyes that there may be certain systemic problems, right, which you want to help deal with. So there's a greater plurality of causes now, and as the movement's grown, it's kind of changed in these ways.
Yeah, so kind of just to go over the three main cause areas that effective altruists currently work on. So the first one, which we've already had quite a bit about, is global health and poverty. And this is something that has interested effective altruists from the very beginning. I think firstly because it's a really obvious problem we all know exists, right? Like we know that there are hundreds of millions of people living in extreme poverty. We know that there are millions of people dying every year from these preventable diseases. We've just heard about this. And most people know that this is going on, regardless of whether they've heard Singer say that or not. So I guess so there's that. But I think also when we go back to the criteria that I mentioned earlier on, in terms of tractability, that's where global health and poverty really makes a lot of sense as a cause, because a lot of research has already gone into this, into what interventions can effectively help this problem. And so there are already a lot of things that we kind of know reliably work. So for example, the Against Malaria Foundation, we've already heard each anti-malarial bed net they distribute costs £1.55, and the charity spends all of their money on these nets, and it's a very reliable way of preventing people from catching malaria. So it's just it's kind of one thing that we're very confident works. There are other charities as well, for example, Give Directly, which basically transfers cash to people in developing countries, which kind of goes against some of the conventional wisdom we hear about charity, but actually, again, it's surprisingly effective. And yeah, there's a lot of evidence behind these causes, and so on the tractability front, it works really well. But in addition to this, the other two cause areas that Singer briefly mentioned, non-human animals and long-term future, as the movement has grown, these causes have greatly expanded in scope alongside global poverty.
Yeah, so to turn to the cause area of animal welfare, the majority of efforts here are focused on trying to alleviate the suffering that takes place in factory farms. As Professor Singer said, every year tens of billions of animals are sort of raised and killed in these horrible conditions, and as such, it's quite a large-scale problem that that we can do things about, right? So different ways of dealing with this problem include persuading people to go vegan, trying to push for better welfare standards in farms, and also looking into meat alternatives such as like lab-grown meat, which might become a consumer product in the next decade or two. And there's also some concern about wild animal suffering. This is a more controversial issue, but essentially the scale of the amount of suffering in nature is so great that some effective altruists think that we should try and intervene in nature to try and alleviate this as well. And as you can see on this graph, just to turn back to the issue of animal farming, the vast majority of animals that are kind of used and killed by humans, the vast majority of them are in factory farms, right? But if you look at the money donated to animal charities, the majority of it is given to shelters and to help animals who might have been abandoned or whatever. So it seems that we have a very, very neglected problem here, and we might not be using our resources in the best way.
So finally then with the long-term future, so there are so if we go back to the three criteria I mentioned at the start, like two out of the three, the long-term future does really well. Because firstly, in terms of presence, like in all likelihood, the vast majority of people who will ever live are not alive yet. So like the number of future people vastly outnumbers the number of people alive today, and therefore the problems that might affect them are therefore potentially really, really important. And then also in terms of neglectedness, far less research has been done into what the future of the planet might look like and how we might be able to make sure that it's as good as possible. But now the problem, of course, is that it's a lot less clear how much we can really affect the future compared to the present. But many effective altruists would argue that some of the issues we're talking about here, things like biohazards, global pandemics, nuclear war, climate change, or trying to make sure that AI systems are as safe and aligned with our values as possible. These are like such big problems that even if there's only a small chance that we can affect them positively, we should nonetheless try. So again, this is like an increasing focus within the movement, an increasing number of people are trying to go into research and policy positions that will hopefully be able to positively affect these changes, or hopefully positively affect these problems in some way. So yeah, that's
Cool. So now we're going to talk a bit about careers. So Singer briefly mentioned the website 80,000 Hours, who are one of the kind of central effective altruism organisations who've kind of been here since the beginning of the movement. And their main focus is helping people get into careers that will allow them to effectively work on these problems. And their suggestions kind of divide into these four main categories, right? So first you have research. Obviously, for many of these problems, we need to do research. So this could be scientific research, perhaps kind of working at a think tank, trying to do research there, or just various kinds of ways in which we can kind of make sense of these problems and figure out how best to deal with them. The second career path type that they suggest is advocacy. And this is essentially growing the movement, trying to get more people involved, working with universities, or just trying to get the message out in a way that sort of clearly explains what effective altruism is about. Thirdly, we have earning to give, which is something we've already seen, and that is the path of taking a job that pays a lot and helping to fund some of these organisations who could benefit from the money. And finally, we have direct work, and this will depend on the cause area, what this involves. So for example, this could involve working for the Anti-Malaria Foundation or some kind of charity where you're actually directly working on the problem as opposed to trying to fund an organisation or just doing research into it.
cool. So in terms of getting involved, I appreciate that there are a lot of links in this slide, but I will be sharing. I'll be sharing the slides on the Facebook event afterwards, and we'll probably also put these links in a separate post so they're easy to access. I think the best place to start really, if you're interested in effective altruism, is the main website, effectivealtruism.org. There's a really good introductory essay that's kind of front and center on the main page that covers a lot of the ground really well, and I think is a good starting point for thinking about what you might be interested in and how you think you might possibly be able to contribute to making the world a better place. 80,000 Hours we've already mentioned. There are also various forums of discussion online. So there's the main Iain Facebook group. There's r/Effective Altruism for those of you who use Reddit, and there's also the EA forum, which is for slightly longer form posts. But in all three cases, there's just a lot of very interesting discussion about how to improve the world, basically. And then finally, just the local Birmingham group. This is our social media at the bottom, and we've got an event coming up next week, which Bryn's going to tell you about now.
Yeah, so in addition to getting involved online, you can also get involved offline. So there are lots and lots of EA events which take place in various parts of the country and the world. In Birmingham, we host a monthly discussion social at Cherry Reds, which is a pub right to New Street Station in town. The next one is next week on Wednesday, so we'd very much like you to come along if you think this would be interesting for you. There's an hour of EA discussion, but this is very sort of casual and you don't need to know much about it to participate. And after that, we tend to just kind of have more of a general chit-chat and kind of catch up and all that kind of thing. There's also events taking place in other universities and other cities. So the largest community of EAs in the country is probably EA London, which I've been to. I've been to quite a few of their events, and they're really fun, really interesting. And there's also, as I mentioned, different EA groups associated with different universities. So kind of, if you're near a large town or a big city or a city, there may well be a EA event taking place near you. So yeah, to sum up, thank you very much for listening, and we hope to see you at one of the next socials. So thank you very much.
Cool, thank
Hi.
Hi.
Hello, can you hear us?
I can hear you fine, yeah.
Excellent. Right, so you're live at the University of Birmingham. Thanks very much for agreeing to join us. Yeah, good morning. I know it's 7 a.m. for you, so thanks for having us on the slate so early in your day. I should say, actually, this is the second time that Peter has done this for Effective Altruism Birmingham. You did this for our launch event in 2012, back when we were giving what we can Birmingham. So thanks for doing it again. Maybe next time you're on your European tour, we can get you here. Okay.
Okay, good.
Super. So you ready to start?
Yes, absolutely.
Super. Okay.
You're going to give me some questions, right?
Yeah. So we're just going to do a Q&A. So we're going to start with questions from the audience, and then we'll move to the kind of pre-submitted questions. So who would like to go first? Okay, we've got a question at the back.
I think it's 90% of people in the US, after paying for 2 years of treatment for cancer, have run out of all their assets completely. Would you say that if you're an effective altruist, you're acting morally if you pay for that treatment rather than giving it to charities and benefiting far more people?
Yes, I'm a bit surprised about that figure actually, because most people in the US have some kind of healthcare coverage, and if you actually do have no assets, if you're really extremely poor, you're covered by Medicaid, which will pay for your treatment. It's not as if most people in the US have no health coverage at all. That just simply isn't the case. Let's say that something like that is the case for some people. If you are an effective altruist, you will give where you're doing the most good with what you have. And cancer treatment in the US is going to be less effective given its cost and given the extent to which it prolongs life. It certainly can relieve pain, which is important. But there are probably better things that you can do with your money in developing countries where people do have no health care or very little health care, where there are various interventions that can save life or extend life or reduce pain and suffering. So in general, I think an effective altruist will probably, if they're living in the United States or living in some other affluent country, they won't be giving domestically. They will be giving to developing countries, and that's going to be doing more good. So yeah, you have to make those tough decisions, I think. But the fact that somebody is living in your own country is not a sufficient reason for saying, I'm going to help them rather than someone else.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Hello, Professor Singer. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can hear you.
I wondered what your reaction was to some people who are adjacent to effective altruism, but think we should be doing much more to fund artificial intelligence researches. So I've read some arguments that say we should divert funds from saving the lives of people now and do everything we can to hasten the existence of genuine artificial intelligence. I wondered what your reaction to that was.
And that, you know, in theory, that can be an effective altruist approach. You simply have to tell the story of why that is going to do more good in the long run than saving lives now. And I guess that, you know, you can imagine such stories. In fact, there are certainly people who are effective altruists who think that we ought to be doing research into AI, but they're usually people who are more worried that AI is going to get smarter than us and is going to take over and get rid of humans. Nick Bostrom's superintelligence book is an example of that kind of argument, and that is certainly accepted by a segment of the effective altruist community. If I understood you correctly, you're talking about something different. You're talking about promoting AI so that it's smarter than we are at solving the problems we have, right? Well, if you think that and you have enough confidence that we can do it well and we can do it safely, and we're not in the process of hastening the development of AI, we're not in the process of taking risks with the future of our species, then that's a possible strategy. I need to see the arguments as to why that is going to actually do so much good, how confident we can be that it's going to do things that will help us to overcome the big problems we face, rather than the things that it's doing now, like beat us at chess or Go or whatever else it might be. And of course, I'm joking. There are much more important things that it is doing. It's and we're using it all the time, I guess, when we do searches or when we translate things, and when we use voice recognition. There's lots of things like that. So, yeah, you need to tell me the story about how it's actually going to help to solve the big problems we face.
Thank you.
Okay, next question.
Hello, Professor Singer. My question is, what do you think it is about people that makes it so that we don't already live in a world where everyone gives away a lot of their money or shares a lot of their resources to create a better world? We've just seen your TED Talk, and it's pretty clearly explained that it's even in their own best interest to do so, and it's not very difficult to lay out the arguments that it's also clearly the moral thing to do. But what do you think it is about people maybe inherently that it makes it difficult to convince them that this is the case, or what stops them from doing that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the answer, to find the answer, you have to think about our evolution and our development over millions of years as social mammals, originally before there were even humans, and then as humans. You have to think about the forces that selected those who survived, those who reproduced, and whose offspring survived. And when you think about that, there are a number of factors that would have been selected for, and other factors that wouldn't have been selected for. So obviously, having a strong interest in your own survival and your own well-being would have been selected for, and particularly your fairly immediate survival, because things that were looking far into the future probably weren't really necessary. Things weren't changing very much. If you could ensure you survive in the next few days, or let's say over the next year, because of the needing food in different seasons, that was probably as far ahead as typically you needed to look. Then you needed to be attached to your children, your offspring. You needed to be have a tendency to care for them and to give preference to them over the offspring of strangers, in particular, or others unrelated children. And you were living in a small group. Even once we were humans, it seemed we were probably living in groups of between 100 or 200 people. So groups where you knew everybody, and you had to develop cooperative relationships with people in your group, so you help people within your group, but people outside your group were not really very relevant to your survival, and in some cases they might have been competing for survival, they might have been hostile to you. So I think we develop tendencies to enable us to survive in those circumstances, which gives us a strong feeling of protecting our children and ourselves and helping others close to us. And these are, we're talking about here fairly direct material needs, providing food, providing shelter, protection from threats, and so on. And so now we live in a world where we're talking about helping distant strangers, even helping people we can never see or actually see who we're helping. And we're talking about projecting further into the future. So I think we don't have the inbuilt nature that makes that come easily to us. It's possible for us because we did develop a capacity to reason, and that capacity enables us to see that yes, there are other people, and yes, they have needs like we do, and perhaps we care to them to some extent, but we don't care to them to anything like the extent we care to those who are close to us and who we know. So even if we recognise that in some sense it is in our interest to help others, to be generous, and that's a fulfilling way to live, it's still competing with these more immediate, short-term and somewhat different kinds of self-interested desires. And I think that's why we struggle, and why it's actually, it's remarkable that people have the extent of the capacity for universal altruism and concern for a long-term future that we do, and I think that's a testimony to the power of our capacity to reason, but it still has to compete with these rather different and more emotionally salient kinds of attitudes that we have. And that's why, for example, we still see today, you have some incident about identifiable individuals, even if they are strangers, like last year the 12 boys in the cave in Thailand with their soccer coach, and everybody's very concerned about that. They watch the news, they're prepared to donate to help those 12 kids, but there they are, because you can identify those individuals. And then somebody said, you could save more lives with that amount of money if you gave to the Against Malaria Foundation and bought bed nets for kids who will otherwise get malaria. But you can't identify the kids that you save. It's not like there's a kid saying, here, donate to me, otherwise I'm going to die within 2 weeks. So it's, you can see the different pools that compare those situations.
Given that global wealth inequality is largely driven by a closing of borders, especially in the West, at least with the refugee crisis, do you think an effective altruist can coherently hold that borders should be closed and wealth distribution should be determined by those kinds of structures?
I think the answer to that depends on what sort of should you're talking about. In an ideal world, I think the answer is clearly no, and an effective altruist should say no. We should allow people to move to where they can do best, and that will even out things, and that will maximise well-being overall. But if you're talking about, should I be a political advocate for open borders today, whether in the United Kingdom or the United States or here in Australia where I am now, I think the answer is no, because we've actually seen what happens given the attitudes that people have to large numbers of immigrants, right? I think clearly fear of more immigrants coming has played a role in the UK Brexit vote. I think it's clearly played a role in the election of Donald Trump, and probably it's helped to keep Conservatives in power in Australia as well, although the polls are showing they may not be in power very much longer. But I think these are disasters, really. especially when you put them in the context not just of admitting refugees or opening borders, but in the context of things like climate change. Okay, so you know, Trump is the clearest example here, right? Trump has done nothing on climate change. He's wound back things. He's talked about promoting coal. I think it's, you know, I don't think Hillary Clinton would have been my ideal president, but she certainly would have been a lot better than Donald Trump in a whole range of aspects. And one of them clearly is climate change. And that's a global disaster. So I think you have to be, unfortunately, realistic on this issue. You have to say, I don't want to see conservative governments elected that will be doing not only bad for people trying to come to my country, but bad in a whole range of other ways. And I therefore have to propose realistic policies that people will accept, or at least that we can persuade people to accept within the next election cycle. And this goes back, I think, to my answer to the previous question. And again, sadly, we do have a kind of element of xenophobia. And as I say, that probably comes from living in smallish societies where we see people from other societies as rivals, as hostile. And we haven't entirely got rid of that, and it comes up now and again in really horrible ways. And we have to do what we can to combat that, but at the same time, we have to recognise that it does exist, that it will be a factor in elections, and we have to take it into account. We can't just ignore it and assume that everybody is an effective altruist and will therefore support what seems to us to be the most rational policies, what indeed are the most rational policies for a longer term, and for a situation in which people are not subject to these racist and xenophobic appeals to close borders.
Hi. I've got a question about the practicalities of effective altruism. So I know that cost effectiveness is an important focus of effective altruism in terms of giving to the most cost effective charities.
Right, yeah.
And I think that it's easier to determine the cost effectiveness of quantitatively measurable goods, as opposed, such as like how many malaria nets can we donate, as opposed to qualitatively measurable goods, say education. And so that could lead to potentially a risk of neglecting these qualitatively measurable goods in favour of those that are more cost effective. And what can we do about that potential risk?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I accept that is a problem with where effective altruism is today, and with the somewhat narrow list of organisations that are recommended by these sort of evaluating organisations like GiveWell in particular. The Life You Can Save, an organisation that grew out of the book I wrote of that title, also somewhat linked to that, although we try to be a little bit wider and a little bit more flexible than GiveWell is in its ratings. But yeah, we do need evidence. So what can we do about that? We can try to develop better ways of essentially turning qualitative rating characteristics into quantitative ones. That is, try to put some sort of numbers on the benefits that occur. You mentioned education in particular. In the long run, education is also harder to evaluate, of course, because it takes years to see what its effect is. But in the long run, you could find ways of measuring the impact of improving education, particularly if you go to countries where there are people who don't have any education or have very poor quality education, and you establish better schools in places, and you compare that with other places where there aren't better schools, and you look at results in terms of how the people who went to those schools are living and what they're doing and so on. So it's not impossible to do that, and there may be other examples where it's even more difficult. But I do think that that's what we need to attempt to do. We need to find ways to compare different things that at the moment we don't really have ways of comparing. And at some point, I guess you need to make difficult judgments. You need to say, well, I think this is more important. I think there are many things like, so let's say improving mental health is one good candidate for making a positive difference of good value in the world. But we need to find ways of evaluating improvements in mental health. Again, there are numbers that you can use. You can say, well, when people with depression are treated, fewer of them end up committing suicide, and so their lives saved. And you can look at those numbers, but that's only one part of it. What about people whose just lives get better, who are happier? And do we have ways of measuring that, and putting numbers on how important it is that people's well-being is better? Not exactly at this stage, but in principle, maybe we can find ways of comparing that. So, there are always going to be difficult judgments to make. I don't think we're going to go over that, but I don't think it's completely hopeless to try to say we can improve the kinds of comparisons we're doing, and we can broaden out to things that are not so easy to quantify and to try to cover other things and find ways of comparing them. I think that's what we have to really do in the long run.
Hello, Professor Singer. I wanted to
Hi.
get your opinion on whether you think more can be done to help individuals in developing countries. So, like earlier in this talk, Iain Law, Dr. Law, mentioned a thought experiment of how you see a drowning toddler, you go and save them at the expense of ruining, your shoes. And so I was thinking, okay, that's like all fine, but like, wouldn't it be sort of more beneficial to like teach the child how to swim? So taking that sort of like logic, like whether we can do something more to say like give developing countries like tools to like help them like cope with sort of and any sort of things that will help them like in the future.
Right. So you're talking about preventing, keeping the analogy, talking about preventing the child needing to be rescued. And what we would like to achieve in terms of assisting developing countries is to make a case that they no longer need our assistance.
Yeah, exactly.
And right?
Yeah.
That's the question, yeah?
Yeah.
So I think that's the aim. And I think most people who are in the work of assisting people in low-income countries agree that is the aim. The problem is how we get there, and there are some projects that succeeded in getting there. I myself, some years ago, I described this in the book The Life You Can Save. I visited people at an Oxfam-funded project in India, where people at the bottom of the caste system, the so-called untouchables, as they're known, were making a living on the city's rubbish dump, sorting recycling out of the rubbish, basically. And Oxfam helped them to organise, to produce a better system where people in buildings separated their own recycling, and then the same people could collect them and take them to dealers for whatever it was they were finding, and also help them sort of basically unionise so that they were better negotiating powers with the dealers to get the prices that they should be getting. And I just happened to be there at a time when the project had been going some years, and I was in the room when they were saying to the Oxfam people, thank you very much for helping us, but we are now organised, we know what to do, and we really don't need your help anymore. And I thought that was a clear evidence that this had been a successful project. But can you do that everywhere? Well, you can certainly, you can do that locally, as in this case. People can say, okay, we don't really need your help anymore. But it's a big world. There are a lot of people to help. There will be some people, of course, who didn't need our help previously, but who, because of changed conditions, possibly due to climate change, failure of rains or flooding or something like that, will need emergency assistance. That probably going to, unfortunately, increase to some extent with climate change. There are going to be, I think, people needing our assistance for a long time. But I totally agree that the aim should be to try to improve conditions so that people are more prosperous, so that countries have more capacity, so that their own governments can help them. And that does happen in some countries that have reasonably good governance. There are other countries where governments are still, unfortunately, more interested in feathering the nests of people who are leading those countries and less concerned to help people in poverty. And that's a problem. It's very difficult to know what to do when you have countries that are not well governed. People still need help. You can't, I think, turn away from people who need help. But in a sense, you're reluctant to do something if there are some people who are living very well in the country, but it's just not helping. So I think we still have situations where we do need to help for quite some time. But in terms of when we have the opportunity to change that, to enable people to be self-sufficient and not to need our help, that's definitely the way we should go.
One of the initial appeals of charities like the Against Malaria Foundation was the certainty that we can have that, for example, we can be certain that if you donate to AMF, your money will be spent on nets, and then we can be we can be certain that the nets will actually meet the people who they're intended for. And people like Nick Bostrom, on the other hand, have looked at a lot of, there's a lot of, I guess, speculative talk about what could happen in the far future, and looking at huge numbers of people and welfare and all that kind of thing. And from his perspective, he might think this is a much larger, we're talking about much larger scale issues, but it seems like there's a lot less certainty in terms of what we can do about it. So my question is, how should we weigh how should we weigh kind of the scale of a problem against the certainty that we can do anything about it, or that it will even be a problem to begin with? Kind of, scale uncertainty.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good question. So, the theoretical answer is that you ought to go by what's known as expected utility. So, expected utility simply tries to say what are the odds that we will do something good here, and you discount the utility. So, let's say the good is 100 and you have a 10% chance of achieving that. Well, then that counts for 10. Whereas if you have a 100% chance of achieving a utility of, let's say, 5, that counts for 5. So a 10% chance of achieving a utility of 100 is better than a certainty of achieving a utility of 5. And then Nick Bostrom comes out with these vast numbers of people who will be able to exist, assuming that our species survives, and suggests that they will have, that we'll have solved all our problems today, and they'll therefore have very rich and positive, fulfilling lives. And so, on his calculations, if you reduce the chance of extinction by even, a very, very tiny percentage, because the numbers of people whose lives you have saved is so large, that will outweigh even, helping 1 billion people to survive today. Now, there's a number of things before you even quite get to the uncertainty in that. One is that when we talk about saving the lives of these, 10 to the 56 or whatever it is people that are going to live, Bostrom calculates, these people, you're not saving the lives in the sense that there's an existing person who's going to die if you don't help, of course. These people would never exist if we would have come extinct, next year, let's say. So you have to say, well, is it as bad if someone never comes into existence and therefore never leads a good life as if somebody who is living now dies? And people have different intuitions on that call. But then Bostrom would say, well, even if you think it's only a tenth as bad, let's say, or as bad, still, again, the numbers will outweigh that, will dwarf that. But there is the question of whether in fact we can, whether we can calculate the odds, and whether we even know when you're talking about something as uncertain as, let's back up a moment. When you're talking about reducing the risk of our species becoming extinct, there are some ways in which our species could become extinct where you can roughly calculate what we ought to do about it, and say, this is going to reduce the chance of extinction. So one way in which we could become extinct is a massive asteroid could collide with our planet, and that could, essentially wipe us out. We can roughly calculate the chances of that happening. It's very small, but there have been asteroid collisions before. We can, and there are things, then you say, well, what can we do about it? Well, we could track. NASA, in fact, already is tracking large objects that might collide with our planet. So we can track that, and if we get enough warning, we could build a rocket that would intercept that asteroid, that would set off an explosion, that would deflect it from its present path just enough to miss us. So there's something fairly concrete you could say. And for something like that, I would say, yeah, that might well be worth doing. Because we can know that what we're doing will contribute positively to this. But if somebody says, as I mentioned before when we got that question about AI, if somebody said, I think there's a risk that developing AI will create a superintelligence that is likely to be malevolent towards us and therefore cause our extinction, or maybe not malevolent, but just sort of, misprogrammed and causes our extinction without, while trying to pursue some other objective. Then you have to say, well, firstly, is there such a risk at all? And I guess you could say, well, yeah, some, very slight maybe, but some. And then, do we have an idea what is really going to prevent that? And I'm not so sure about that. Now, I'm not really expert in this field, but do we now have enough knowledge to do something about that? Or is it, in fact, might it be that researching this will in some way accelerate that? That's something perhaps people will have a much better understanding of in 10 or 20 or 30 years when we're further developed AI. It's those kinds of uncertainties where you don't even know whether you are moving in the right direction to reduce that risk that I think are a problem in some of the more speculative cases. And so there, you can't be that confident. Let me say one more thing about this whole area, for those who, what I just said, is not convincing, and I think people like Nick Boston is probably not convincing. And that is the idea of supporting and donating towards reducing the risk of extinction is something that isn't really appealing to very many people in our community now. We can go back to the earlier answer I gave about our evolution and what kind of people we are. We as I said, but then we'll respond to appeals from help from strangers, particularly if they're identifiable strangers. We do now, a good number of people do respond to appeals to help for things like helping kids not get malaria, even if it's not an identifiable kid in a distant country. How many people are going to respond to saying, well, look, there's a possibility of 10 to the 56 people living, great lives if we don't become extinct, but AI could cause us to become extinct. Will you donate for this? Not very many, right? It's not zero, but not very many people. And I think, so we actually lose the opportunity to build a broad EA movement. And I think what I know Simon and others who've organised this meeting and other meetings around the world in many other universities and other places are interested in building a broad EA movement. Because that will do good in various concrete ways. And in fact, once you get into this, there may be, one or two people in the room now who are saying, yeah, I do think, I don't think what Singer said there was very convincing, and I do think that it's really important for us to try to reduce extinction risk. So if you bring 100 people into a room, you might actually, and you do that by talking about global poverty and other concrete things that will bring 100 people into a room, you might find that that's actually a way of getting one or two of them to think about extinction risk. And that might actually be a beneficial thing to do. So I think that's another reason why we shouldn't neglect the more concrete, more attractive, more easily graspable outside of EA, like global poverty, and simply say, no, this is not important compared to preventing the risk of extinction.
So these questions are probably very similar to the ones that we've just been asked, but I'll just read them out. So the first question is, the pond analogy is a very thought-provoking idea. However, do you think it is problematic in how it doesn't account for how the child comes to be drowning in the pond, i.e. it ignores the institutional and systematic causes of poverty, for example, protectionist trade policies or structural adjustments? And if so, is our obligation not to address these causes of poverty, perhaps by lobbying or voting for governments with progressive economic policies, instead of individually donating to effective charities?
Yes, yeah, it's a little bit like some of the questions that we've had, but it's not exactly the same. But my answer, you know, perhaps predict from what I've been saying. Yes, if you do have something reasonably concrete that is contributing to poverty, and that might be trade policies that we have, certainly, and if you have a reasonable chance of influencing those policies, then that can be an excellent strategy. And some of the organisations that the Life You Can Say recommends, this is one of the differences between our recommendations and GiveWell, we do take that into account. So we recommend Oxfam, for example. Oxfam is a very large organisation. It's difficult to quantify all the different things that it does many, many different things. But one of the things it does is it is an advocate for developing countries on issues like trade. And so if we're going to get better trade policies that will help developing countries, then we need organisations like Oxfam that have offices in, say, you know, Oxfam in the United States has its headquarters in Boston, but it has a Washington office specifically to lobby Congress on behalf of low-income countries. And sure, it does the same, obviously, in the UK. I do think that that's worth doing. I think in each case you're going to have to calculate, but personally I have donated to Oxfam in the US and specifically to its lobbying. You have to make the donation separately because you don't get a tax deduction for donating for political lobbying in the US anyway. So I think that has been worth doing, and I think that has paid dividends. It's not the only thing that I do, obviously, to support various organisations, but I do think that where you have a well-organised, effective group working to do that, can be a good thing to do, to have a reasonable expected utility return.
So when it comes to someone like you love or care about, so say, like you could give money to like save the life of your mum versus all these people like who you don't know, like are you not being an effective altruist if you do something like that?
Would you like me to repeat the question?
Please do, yeah, I didn't really hear it all.
So when it comes to being an effective altruist to somebody that you care about, for example, your mum,
Versus like giving to people who are strangers. 'Cause
Yeah,
I think
so-
people are more likely to.
yeah,
I think most people say they'd save their mum. Like, and are you being a bad person for doing that?
So if you're giving to your mum, are you not still being an effective altruist even though you haven't given to the stranger?
Well, that's going to depend on how much good you're giving to your mum does as compared to what you can do for strangers. So you're in the UK, you have a national health service. It's not perfect, I know, but it provides a level of healthcare that 1 billion or more people in the world can't really dream of having. And so if your mother is ill and needs medical treatment, she'll get it without you giving to her, whereas other people won't. Now, there may be other things, of course, that you can give to make her life better, but it's probable, this is a generalisation obviously, but it's probable that the same amount of money would do more good for people in a low-income country who have no access to even the most basic health care, who, for example, we use it, dying from malaria or don't have safe drinking water, or their kids get diarrhea and don't have any oral rehydration therapy and die from that, and so on. So effective altruists want to do the most good that they can, and If you are living in an affluent country, probably it costs more to benefit, basically, to benefit your mum than it does to benefit a stranger in another country. So, an effective altruist will think, I ought to be helping strangers. That doesn't mean that an effective altruist is going to be effective with everything they spend. After all, we spend things on ourselves that aren't as effective as giving to strangers either. So it's not as if you won't be helping your family at all. You'll just be thinking, yeah, I'm doing that. That's something I want to do. But that's not part of my effective altruism, really. That's more like spending money on myself, which is something that I'm prepared to do to an extent, but I'm going to be an effective altruist with some part of my expenditure. People vary with how much of that it is, but hardly anybody is an effective altruist with 100% of what they spend.
So we have one final pre-submitted question, which is, do you think that it is essential for an effective altruist to not only give effectively to charities, but try to achieve positive political reform with the goal of maximum happiness?
Okay, yes, I would be prepared to say yes to that, but again, let me go back to things that I've said. It's going to depend on what the chances are of success in achieving that. I certainly think that it's an effective altruist goal to achieve political reform with the aim of maximising happiness. There are many strategies that will do that. One thing that I've already mentioned is mental health treatment. There is evidence, and I know some people have studied this more carefully than I have, that providing treatment for mental illness is a major way of reducing suffering, and that is also true in affluent countries where there is some treatment, but typically treatment for mental health is more limited. So, that might be a kind of reform, a kind of change that will produce maximum happiness, and is certainly worth doing. Exactly, again, as I said earlier, how you compare that with the very concrete things that you can do in low-income countries is not at all easy to know. I know the question mentioned political reform, and I don't know whether the questioner had in mind some specific political changes. You would need to say, well, what do you mean by the political reform, and how is that going to lead to benefits? I mean, are we talking about things like improved voting systems or changes of that kind, changes in governance? I can certainly think in whatever country you're in, I can think of things that would be improvements. I'm in Australia where we have compulsory voting. It's rather unusual in the world. If you don't vote in an election, you actually can get fined, modest fine, $25 or something. I think if you'd had compulsory voting in Britain, you wouldn't now be wasting a lot of time talking about Brexit. So I think that would be a positive reform. And probably you wouldn't have Donald Trump president of the United States if you had it there either. So I think that's a desirable political reform. From my experience, it leads to better outcomes. But what are the chances of achieving it? In the United States, I could say they're extremely small because of this American view about not having the state coerce me. But yeah, they'd be reforms, and I think that if you have some chance of achieving them, they'd be worth working for.
Okay, well that wraps up all the questions. Thank you so much, Peter Singer, for
Okay, good.
For everything.
Be happy to have the chance to answer your questions, and thanks for that opportunity. And I hope your EA group continues to be successful. It's good to see some years after I first spoke to you that you're active and getting a lot of people into a room. So well done. Keep going.